people across our nation and around our world. Our home is in the historic 1844 Seneca Knitting Mill, which has stood as a beacon of hope and inspiration to generations of people. There's something magical about standing in our building and looking out to the banks of the Cayuga-Seneca Canal and really understanding on a deep level how important that waterway is to our entire nation. The canal was a driver for so many important conversations, and Seneca Falls was a major hub for the flow of information and for the exchange of ideas that allowed for important movements to begin, from abolitionism to the women's rights movement. Our mission and the work we do is further enhanced because of our ability to call this historic building home. The Seneca Knitting Mill is one of the few surviving mills in this area, and its history is deeply intertwined with the mission of the National Women's Hall of Fame. For 155 years, the Seneca Knitting Mill produced woolen goods. Owners and management did not want to support slavery, and they made the decision to not use cotton for any of their products, and instead sourced wool from local sheep farmers. This was also one of the only businesses that employed women and immigrants, so it was a place for advancement, empowerment, and achievement. In fact, 2 of this building's original trustees attended the first Women's Rights Convention. We consider it a privilege to steward such a historic treasure. In the months and years to come, and with the generosity of donors, we will continue our work to renovate this building, expanding our exhibits and gathering spaces into the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors. Our museum and gallery space will be a pilgrimage site for people across the world to visit and feel energy, excitement, and inspiration from the stories we tell about the incredible achievements of our inductees. Storytelling is how history comes alive. I think about the little girl in Wyoming, the little boy in Maine, the professional who wants to change careers at 55, the new father who is raising triplet girls, the teen who is struggling to tell their parents they are transgender, the grandmother who wants to leave this world a better place for her family. The National Women's Hall of Fame has a place in inspiring all of these people and inspiring you. This is a great time to get involved. Join us.
For this intimate conversation. I'm New York State Inspector General Lucy Lang. I use she, her pronouns. And I want to begin by acknowledging that we are standing on the lands of the Gayakono Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and by honoring all of the Indigenous nations and their land with great gratitude, and to acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of Indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built New York State during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon the Indigenous communities and upon communities of color across the country, which inspires all of our ongoing work. I also want to acknowledge that we will be discussing difficult topics today. Please take care of yourselves during the conversation. And if you or someone you know is a victim of gender-based or sexual violence, there are resources available on the New York State Hotline at 1-800-942-6906. As New York State Inspector General, I am thrilled to be here 174 years after the first Women's Convention was convened here, because the integrity of government is a woman's issue. It's a queer issue, an issue for Black and brown communities, non-citizen communities, and Indigenous communities, because a government that doesn't operate with integrity protects entrenched interests, and it privileges power over people. And that's what brings us here on this historic anniversary, to talk about New York State's centrality in the battle for all of our rights that continues, sadly, to rage around us. As the state agency charged with overseeing the integrity of New York State, the offices of the Inspector General are so proud to have convened this extraordinary group of leaders. I'm also very proud to share the work of my office on enforcing the recent executive order issued by our state's first female governor, directing all state agencies to provide trauma-informed support to staff who are at risk of suffering. With this order, following a devastating domestic violence murder of a state employee in 2019, New York has doubled down on its investment in prevention. To that end, there really is room for some celebration today. Our office's statewide investigation into all the agencies under our jurisdiction has found that most are already well on their way to complying with the new executive order, including receiving training from the state's Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, headed by our distinguished panelist, Kelly Owens. And more than half the agencies across the state are already offering annual training to staff on the issue of domestic violence in the workplace. So there's certainly still much work to be done, but it's clear that New York State is eager to do it. Please see ig.ny.gov and our social media later today to learn more about this groundbreaking work. But it is far more than my professional role that bring me here, as I'm sure is true for all of you. As a woman and a New Yorker, I'm also glad to be here because addressing women's rights has never been more important than now in the wake of Dobbs v. Jackson, which is personal to me, as it is to many women and girls. As a 25-year-old attorney, I made the choice to have an abortion that enabled me to plan a family and a career that give me the ability to do this meaningful work, and that ultimately brought me here today with these incredible women. So it's in all of these capacities that I am honored to introduce Professor Tamar Carroll, Chair of History at Rochester Institute of Technology, a scholar of modern US history, women's and gender history, public history, and digital humanities, who has published books including Mobilizing New York, AIDS, Anti-Poverty, and Feminist Activism, and Nasty Women and Bad Hombres, Gender and Race in the 2016 US presidential election. The Honorable Kathy Davidson is the Dean of the New York State Judicial Institute, a statewide judicial education and research center. She is actually in the middle of a multi-week training institute right now where 1,000 judges from across the state are getting trainings that she has constructed, including on some of the issues that we're here to explore today. She is also the administrative judge for the 9th Judicial District, which encompasses Dutchess, Orange, Putnam, Rockland, and Westchester counties. Judge Davidson has previously served as a family court judge, a deputy county attorney, and a juvenile rights attorney. In addition to her many accomplishments and honors, Judge Davidson was the first African-American woman appointed as supervising judge in the 9th Judicial District, and the first African-American to be appointed administrative judge outside of New York City. Executive Director Kelly Owens of the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence oversees the country's only executive-level state agency dedicated to the issue of gender-based violence. Kelly has served as New York State's Director of Women's Affairs and played a huge role in launching the state's first ever Council on Women and Girls. She has previously served as Vice President for External Affairs for Family Planning Advocates of New York and Planned Parenthood Advocates of New York. And Michelle Shenandoah is a speaker, writer, thought leader, and traditional member of the Oneida Nation Wolf Clan of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. She is the founder and executive director of the nonprofit Rematriation and the co-founder of Indigenous Concepts Consulting. She is a creator of multimedia stories who brings the voices of Indigenous women to the public, and recently presented as a spiritual advisor to the Pope in the First Nations delegation at the Vatican that prompted his apology regarding residential schools. So although we chose this date to acknowledge the convention, women's history on this land, of course, dates far back beyond that time, indeed far before colonization. Michelle, can you please paint in some broad strokes a picture of some of the indigenous communities who were native to what we now call New York State and the roles of women in particular?
Yeah. Siguli Sigweg, Gluhianuas, Neogets, Onyote Akani'i. I'm Michelle Shenandoah, member of the Oneida Nation, and very happy to be here. Thank you so much for having us today and to be a part of this panel. So we are actually on the lands of the Gayakono Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which consists of 6 nations from the Mohawk, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, and the Tuscaroras. And we actually are the primary influence to the US Constitution and to women's rights. And there's a lot that is to be said for that. We are still a living government and peoples to this day, and we have the oldest continuous democracy on the planet. So a lot of people really are not sure where democracy stemmed from, and sometimes think that maybe it came from the Greeks, but it didn't. It came from right here. And so being here on these territories, I think it's really important to note that we're still here. And those founding fathers and founding mothers of the women's suffrage movement really gained so much insight by living among us, being with us, and really just felt incredible freedoms they had never felt anywhere before, and sometimes chose to live with us rather than with their own people. And women are central. We are the seat of authority in our governments. And that is one critical element that the founding fathers left out. And I do believe on purpose, because that's not the system that they came from. That's not the history or understanding that they knew that women could have such power within community, within government, and within the daily lives, because women were property. And so the women here, we had absolute freedom. We didn't have to fear violence, sexual assault. And it didn't really exist at the time that they were here and having those types of interactions with us. So, that's something we can explore in the conversation today, but I think that that's really important to recognize, because there's still a lot to be learned. Our people have been speaking for generations to the American public and really trying to emphasize these points and understand the relationship that we have that goes back to early treaty agreements that predate the Constitution, but that are in the Constitution themselves.
Thank you for that. In addition to these rich traditions, Tamar, can you share a bit about how New York came to be such a hub of women's political activism during and after the colonial era and continuing today? What role has Seneca Falls and the surrounding area in particular played? And can you also please touch on the racism that was manifested in the suffrage movement?
Sure. Thank you, Lucy, for including me in this panel. It's great to see you all and to be part of this today. Michelle spoke about the inspiration that Native American women provided to white women in Western New York. They came here as the canal opened up transportation, and this was an area of religious revivalism. There were Quakers that settled here that believed in equality of all people and in educating girls. There was also a large movement to end slavery, right? The Underground Railroad came through this area, and there was a movement for temperance. So all of that supported women's rights. And that included not only suffrage, the right to vote, but also the right to have equal educational opportunities, the right to own property and to have control of one's wages, and the right to have custody of one's children. That was a right that Native American women already had, of course, but European women, because of the patriarchal nature of English society and English common law, did not have. And so women came here along with men for the convention in 1848, which really touched off a mass movement for women's rights. And in 1917, New York State was the first Eastern state to pass women's suffrage. So that was a very long campaign. Along the way, the Married Women's Property Act gave women in New York State the right to own property and to control their wages, which was very important. In terms of racism within the women's rights movement, in 1869, there was a big split in the movement, and this was in the aftermath of the Civil War. Most women's rights activists had been abolitionists. They believed in ending slavery, but the division came down over the 14th and 15th Amendment to the US Constitution and whether everyone should get the right to vote, women and black men at the same time, or whether black men should be enfranchised first. And so Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton opposed the 15th Amendment unless it also gave women the right to vote. And they formed the New York-based National Women's Suffrage Association. In contrast, Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, and Julia Ward Howe believed that all men should get the right to vote first and then women. And they created the Boston-based American Women's Suffrage Association. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, and it granted voting rights to all men without regard to race and color. Of course, under Jim Crow, black men were subsequently disenfranchised. In the aftermath of the 15th Amendment passing, though, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were very frustrated, and they accepted funds from a notorious racist, George Francis Train, who had opposed enfranchising black men in order to publish their newspaper, The Revolution. So that created a lot of backlash, and I think the movement really didn't unify again until the next generation of activists.
So the first female magistrate in New York State actually took the bench in 1919, which was the same year that the 19th Amendment ultimately passed. So Judge, having spent your career in New York's courts, including its family courts, how has the legal landscape changed for women and families during the course of the past century, and in particular during the course of your career, and if you could speak also in particular to women of color?
So first, thank you to the Inspector General for having me and being on this panel with these great women and your voices. So there has been a lot of changes. I think that when you think back to over the first woman and then also the first African-American woman, Jane Bolin, who became the first female black judge in New York State, the mayor asked her husband if it was all right if she became a judge. So we've come long and far from there. But we still are continuing to have we're still fighting the good fight, so to speak. So we do have more women coming into the profession, and we have women judges sitting on the bench. However, there still has to be the mindset that has to change. So personally, sitting in family court, and almost for about 20 years, close to 20 years, I've sat in the family court. We see a shift in terms of how we look at women, how we see women coming in, and with their children. And it's important because with these changes from, especially, I know we'll get a little bit later into domestic violence, it's the view of how a woman comes into court and ultimately the remedies that are actually fashioned for that woman. And that's begun to change. And I think that's because we have more women in the legal profession, allowing us to have a voice. If we're not present, and as we know, and giving great honor to Frederick Douglass, who said women are the best to speak for themselves, we're now at the table at a training beginning to say how we address women and women in the profession. And also women are moving beyond those traditional professions that women go into. I chose family law. I believe that's what I was supposed to do. But now women are going into other areas of the law, and we have women who are DAs. We look at our government now, which is run by women. So we're seeing a great movement and change in terms of women moving into positions of power.
It's fitting and proper that we're here in Seneca in part, as you say, to talk about domestic violence. So local lore has it that the reason that the first Women's Rights Convention was here in upstate New York was that because after the Erie Canal was constructed, what had previously been an agrarian community became an industrial one, and that men who had previously been farmers transitioned to getting a paycheck on Fridays that they could then blow at the tavern, which led to an increase in alcoholism and contributed to increasing domestic violence, ultimately leading the women of Western New York to stand up and say no more, inspired in large part by their Indigenous sisters. So Kelly, can you talk a bit about how New York has handled the scourge of domestic violence historically, and how the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence ultimately came to be a groundbreaking national organization?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, but first let me say thank you for sharing your story. It's brave, and it's what people need to hear. So I thank you for sharing your truth here today and with everybody, because that's how we're going to make sure people understand the impact the decisions that are being made by the Supreme Court. So just wanted to say that. So, you know, to your point, Lucy, you know, if you read the Declaration of Sentiments, you see throughout that document the impact of violence, family violence has in that document, right? It's a fiery document. It's not like, you know, milk toast. It's based in, you know, women's trauma, that document. So, but New York has really set out to really be a leader in women's rights from the very beginning. You know, the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence was formed in 1992 as, and then in 93, this is our 30th anniversary this week that we're a state agency. And we've gone through a lot of iterations as a state agency. We're very proud of the work that we do. But we're looking at the system that exists now. You know, we left a lot of voices out of that system when we built it. I like to think of it as, you know, as we recognize things as a crime, money started pouring in and support started coming in. And a lot of the supports that we looked to were criminally justice-based supports. We know that doesn't work for everybody. We know that system doesn't work for everybody. So OPDV now is really on a mission to build a more culturally responsive, trauma-informed, and survivor-centered system. And I think we're getting there, but we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of partners to partner with to make sure that the voices who have traditionally been left out of that system are heard, and that we're not continuing the power and control over victims of domestic and sexual violence. So that a little bit of our history is based in who we are as a state and what we value and what we honor. But where we go now, I think, is really what we got to talk about.
Yeah, so on that score, Michelle, can you talk a bit about how these issues manifest in Indigenous communities, if there are unique concerns to Indigenous communities related to family-based violence? And if you could also speak a bit to the devastating history of murdered and missing Indigenous women.
It's very unique, actually. And what you have to do is you have to go back in history, you have to go back in time, and you have to go back to the early days of discovery, as it's called in history books, and look at what gave European explorers their right to come to the Americas and to claim lands. And that really goes back to the reason why I was addressing the Pope back in April and at the end of March. And really, what it is, there's papal bulls that were created that have come to make up this doctrine of discovery. And that really said to European explorers, okay, you can go to the Americas and you can claim the lands and the names of the crowns of Europe, but they did that because the Pope at that time basically had declared that the indigenous peoples in the Americas, because we were not Christian, we didn't have souls and we didn't have a right to the lands, and therefore the explorers could do whatever that they wanted to us, enslave, murder, rape, and that's exactly what happened. There's a very, very violent history that's there. But what's truly problematic is that fundamentally it's the basis for land right and claim by the United States for all of the United States. And so every law student who goes to school, when you go into your first real property class, that's what you learn, starting out right from the beginning. Doctrine of discovery. There's no discussion about how it impacted indigenous peoples, what are the long-term impacts. And most Americans don't really think about it. And law informs policy, policy informs education, and education informs how people come to treat each other. And so there's a long history in this country of invisibilizing indigenous peoples and voices. And so for the European explorers, when they came here, who was sort of the biggest impediment to settlement? It was the women, because we have say over the land, we have say over our children, we have say over our nations. And so therefore, this violence began there. It sparked, and it's been perpetuated throughout the years, that you can even see to this day that it has been basically legal for non-native people to commit violence against indigenous peoples, and in particular indigenous women, without having any recourse in the law. And so there's been a lot of effort by indigenous peoples in women to rectify that. However, that's been ongoing for hundreds of years. And so when you look at the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women today, you can see that is the source. And it's really problematic because it's embedded in the fabric and the foundation of US law. And so it's been very easy for generations now to just not see Indigenous peoples, because it's seen that we don't have souls, we don't have voice, we don't have, you know, any particular sort of standing under this law and the way that people have come to see us. So it is really very specific, but then further, you know, it deals with issues of residential schools, issues of termination, and these are all policies by the US government to commit a long, slow genocide against our people.
Speaking of policies that hurt vulnerable populations, Tamar, given your work in gender history, can you speak a bit to gender-based violence against LGBTQ plus communities?
Yes, thank you. Homophobia and transphobia lead to violence against queer people. And unfortunately, we saw this during the height of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and 1990s, when gay men were demonized by conservative religious leaders, and homophobes targeted gay men and lesbians for violent attacks. Today, there's transphobia, including legislation barring trans students from playing sports in public schools, and this will unfortunately lead again to more violence against trans people. Studies suggest that around half of transgender people and bisexual women will experience sexual violence at some point in their lives. LGBTQ people in general have higher rates of poverty and homelessness. They face higher rates of hate-motivated violence. They are also more likely to be incarcerated, which is another risk factor for being a victim of violence. According to the Human Rights Campaign, the ways in which society both hypersexualizes LGBTQ people and stigmatizes queer relationships can also lead to intimate partner violence that stems from internalized homophobia and shame. So really, if we want to end violence, we have to dismantle homophobia and change those attitudes, which are some of the same attitudes that you were talking about in terms of being based in Christianity or in certain interpretations of Christianity.
So, Judge, given the complexity of these issues, how have the courts responded to a changing culture around diversity?
I would say what we've done or we're doing is really education. So all these issues that we're hearing about determination of the parental rights because of the Indigenous people, that comes before a family court. The issues around domestic violence, these issues around gender fairness, ends up in the courts. So what the court has to do is really address the issue from the perspective of who is that person sitting in front of me, and what are the issues that's brought them here before the court, not just that the issue of what's being charged. On a personal level, supervising judge, I started a girls' court because I saw that there was predominantly girls of color coming into the juvenile delinquency cases. And why? And we realized that all of this is because of the fact of racism, gender inequality, and it expanded even into the LGBTQ community. So I bring that up because I also was faced with the fact, well, Judge, why would you start a girls' court? What about the boys? And it's always what about the boys? But what we know through research is that if you help and embrace the girls, it will have the effect to improve with the boys, because of the patriarchal society that we've grown up in. So the courts are looking at it, and I'll close on this section with one of the first things I did as the dean of the New York State Judicial Institute. We also teach new judges. So we brought in survivors of domestic violence, so the judges can begin to see, this is what this person looks like. This is their story, including girls. So it's a sensitivity to understand, because otherwise you'll have a judge who I've listened to on tape saying, well, why did you stay? Why didn't you leave? You don't look so bad today. Well, who would think in the And this, now, someone would say that, but they do. So that's some of the ways that we're beginning to get them early and begin to have that educational process as to humanize who that person is.
It's all the more concerning right now when studies tell us that domestic violence increased during shelter in place and quarantine during COVID. So does anyone have anything to offer about how COVID has affected these issues?
Sure. So, you know, OPDV was charged really early on during the pandemic to keep an eye on domestic violence. Everybody was afraid of the isolation. So we, you know, started to really look and talk to the shelter system and the provider system about what was happening. And what we saw happen was that in the first couple of 3 to 4 weeks, our calls into our hotline dropped, calls into for criminal justice intervention dropped, and then it started to spike. And it spiked as high as, you know, about, it leveled off at about 45% into the hotline. What's interesting is the calls to criminal justice intervention stayed low. So people were looking for more creative interventions into their domestic violence. It also laid bare what we already knew about the system, right? The system needed to be more flexible. And here in New York, a lot of our infrastructure is based in shelter. And if you're in a pandemic, you can't go into shelter. So how are we finding safety and support for people outside of the shelter system? And we know that shelter isn't the first option for many, many people for lots of reasons, right? They have to, the shelter may be 50 miles away if you live in the North Country here, right? So you're picking up your kids and everything and you're moving into a shelter and you don't know where your next move is. So, you know, we're really trying to look at what we learned through COVID to change the system so that we're looking at different options and letting survivors tell us what they need as opposed to what we think they need, which is a big change for the system.
If I could,
Judge.
one thing we did during, when my previous hat as administrative judge is a new one, we actually started a safe haven at churches. So that if, because of the very fact that you're talking about, that victims of domestic violence, where do they go? The courthouses, we never were closed, but how do I get to the courts? How do I access? And we really set up a remote system where they would go to a church and remote in and seek protection of the court. Interesting, we set it up for all. Most of the initial first case was for seeking relief on order of protection. Very wealthy woman, her husband was an attorney. He had access to her computer, her mother's computer. The only safe haven was for her to go to a church, the AME Zion Church, the church of Harriet Tubman. So you're exactly right, finding different avenues because many women, affluent, don't have the access to get the services that they need.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we're kind of going backwards, right? We built this whole system, but prior to that, women were helping women find safety and support before we built all of these big systems. I think we're going back to really that more of, I'm gonna listen to what you need.
Right.
I'm gonna listen to what you need, and I'm gonna help you find what you need to find your safety. You know, I was one of those women in the early 90s saying, you know, we got to criminalize this, we got to criminalize this, and yes, that's absolutely an option, and we should have it. But it can't be the only option in which we get women to safety. And you know, being flexible and understanding what somebody needs is really the answer.
Yeah. So many of us oversee teams, serve as bosses, and you know, it's not just about violence. So what can and should bosses do to ensure that workplaces aren't just safe for women, but that they are decent and dignified and free of sexual harassment? Any of you?
Well, we already have laws in place, so I think it really talks about leadership. I think it's a leadership at the top, and we have federal laws, state laws. And so I think that it's incumbent upon we as women to speak out. I think that's the biggest piece of all of this. And in my role as a supervisor, I can't do anything if someone doesn't come to me and say there's an issue. So I think that's the first one, embracing.
Well, and I'm sure it's not lost on anyone that our first female governor took office as a result of her predecessor's gender-based harassment in the workplace scandal. And we're really living in a historic time in terms of women's leadership across the state, with a woman governor, a woman attorney general, and really record numbers of women in local government. So can you talk a little bit about what's exciting about being a woman in government right now?
Sure. So what's exciting is you can see the influence of women in policy. The executive order that happened really is a direct impact on your leadership, Lucy, and the governor's leadership to say, listen, as an employer, we're going to make sure women are safe and victims of domestic violence. I just want to acknowledge that, yeah, it is a very gendered issue. It's mostly women victims, and we do, we want to acknowledge that there are other genders affected. I think you can see that. I think you can honestly feel that within state government, that there is a willingness to listen on the part of the governor and the legislature in regards to how we need to change systems around childcare and all of the supports that women need to be successful, while at the same time it feels as though the federal government is going in a different direction. So it's exciting, and it feels like we have to be that beacon of hope in the nation.
Just what you're doing today. I don't know how many inspector generals would think about honoring today, and that you're doing that. That's because you're there.
Well, learning from the best, really. Michelle, are there things that you think that women in leadership should learn from Indigenous culture and traditions?
So I can only speak as a Haudenosaunee woman. I can't speak for all Indigenous peoples, and I can speak to our form of government where women are really the inherent seat of authority. We have full autonomy over our minds, our bodies, our children, our homes, the lands, and we really are the voice of the people. And why is that? Because women tend to be the caretakers, and they listen to the voices of all of their children. And that's really the role also of our clan mothers. And our clan mothers are really the ones who oversee the political, spiritual welfare of the people. But they also are the guide and confidant for our chiefs. And people tend to think, because we have chiefs, that, oh, the chiefs are in charge. And they're not. They actually really defer to and listen to the leadership of our women. And they become the voice for the people. And now what's really interesting is if our chiefs begin to act self-interested and start to make decisions for themselves or what they think is best for them or a particular group, that the clan mother has a right of recall to take that position back and to give it to somebody else. But what's really interesting is that the women and the clan mothers, they're actually watching our children from when they're really little. And they're watching how people behave over time and begin to identify leadership from a very early age. It's not about, a political moment where somebody is speaking the right agenda. It's really truly watching people over time and also cultivating that leadership among the people from early ages. And so for me, I think this is like also a moment of education. And when I'm thinking about truth-telling, right? And what can we learn from each other? And it's understanding that educational process and developing that leadership early is really important. So I think it's so wonderful to see, looking out on the landscape of American culture and seeing so many women coming into leadership, because that truly resembles the form of democracy that our people gave and lent as the opportunity to say, okay, here is a system that can bring multiple interests, multiple nations, multiple states, if you will, to be able to come together, to have consensus, to have true equity among all people, and to be able to have that true inclusion and diversity of voice. So I think it's just really essential to kind of really look back to those roots and say, what are those critical elements that maybe were left out, that are missing? And so I think it's just wonderful, though, to see so many women really just stepping into that power today and overseeing the interests of women, of children, and really recognizing how trauma impacts everybody. As humankind, we are traumatized, and the history of this country is incredibly traumatic. And it's not just a one-way trauma, it goes both ways. So someone cannot inflict harm upon somebody else without feeling the trauma themselves. And so as a country, and we look at the history of colonization, I think overall that people can begin to see how everybody is traumatized by this history, and how do we begin to work through that process. And trauma-informed care is just essential. So it's wonderful to see that this is coming into the courts, and those voices and perspectives are being heard. It's also time now to also bring that into the educational system, right? Because we can't continue to teach a false history that leads young children to believe that the founding of this country is just so wonderful, and yay, let's all celebrate on the 4th of July. How great is that? Or, you know, think that Christopher Columbus discovered America, right? Or that the story of Thanksgiving. There's just these very, very false narratives that paint a history and a picture for people that is very misinformed and misguided, and it really misses the opportunity to be able to see each other as human beings today, and to be able to really recognize the history that you spoke about right in your land acknowledgement in the beginning.
You know, speaking of false history, the majority opinion in Dobbs v. Jackson mentions history 67 times. And the Organization of American Historians and the American Historical Association, who had filed amicus briefs arguing that the US had a long history of legal abortions, those organizations have since issued a statement arguing that the Dobbs opinion does not meet the high standards of historical scholarship set forth by the profession. Tamar, can you speak a bit to that opinion from a historical perspective?
Yes, thank you. Well, the Dobbs decision, written by Samuel Alito, ignores historical evidence that shows that for hundreds of years, under English common law and then under US law, termination of pregnancy before quickening, which is the time when a woman first feels fetal movement, which is often around 4 months, was not a crime. And in fact, in the 1820s, when some states began to criminalize abortion, it was because of women's deaths. It was not over concern for fetuses, it was over concerns that unsafe abortions were leading to the death of women. There was a successful national campaign by male physicians in the American Medical Association to criminalize abortion. This was in part due to their desire to get rid of competition for female patients from midwives. Female midwives often performed abortions as well as delivering babies, and so they were concerned with that. They were also concerned because native-born white Protestant women were limiting their reproduction. They were having smaller families as they moved from farms to industrial cities, and they didn't need so many children to work the farm, and instead children became expensive because you had to educate them. And so their ideal family size was shrinking, and they were using birth control or abstinence within marriage, and in some cases abortion as well, to limit their family size. And so by the late 1800s, this campaign was successful, and the majority of states did criminalize abortion. And what we know in general, historical evidence shows us, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, that women have always sought to control their reproduction, and that when abortion is made a crime, women will die from illegal abortions. So we know that this has happened in the past, and unfortunately we know it is going to happen now in the United States because of this Supreme Court decision overturning Roe.
So in the wake of this historically unsound opinion, New York State recently announced a $10 million dedication to abortion provider support. Judge, how is this investment likely to make an impact on women?
I think it'll make a huge impact. First of all, it'll allow for a safe space for women to come to New York in order to have abortions. We know that historically, we have been a leader here in New York State, so it's important from that perspective. And we know that to combat what's happened, you have to have money. I mean, that's just the reality of where we are now. So I think it's going to transform, to at least at this level, make a difference in terms of letting women across the United States know that there is a place here, New York, and will address these issues.
Kelly?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, I think, speak to trauma, right? I think women are going through a very traumatic time right now, seeing the historical trauma coming back and us being, once again, our rights being taken away. I mean, I just think about my daughter, who is 23, now has less rights than I ever had. New York has been a forward thinker in this issue forever, right? 1970, we legalized before Roe. And I just, to the point of power and control and property, there isn't anything more that you can think about than forcing somebody to become a mother when she doesn't want to. And we see this issue of Roe being, and I refuse to use Dobbs, I'm going to always use Roe being dropped back. We see that as a real danger for women who are living in domestic violence situations, because pregnancy, whether to have or have not a pregnancy, has always been a matter of control. 85% of women who are in domestic violence situations report reproductive coercion. And we often don't think of that as a society, right? We don't paint that picture of what this looks like for somebody. And I think it's important that when we start to talk about these things, we talk about those types of realities that are going to happen, that women are going to die, and women are going to be forced into motherhood when they aren't ready. Children are going to be forced into motherhood when they're not ready. It's a frightening time.
Michelle, do you have thoughts on this bleak landscape and the path forward?
It's certainly such a challenging time, and as Haudenosaunee women, we've always had control over determining the time of when to become a mother, when to give birth, based on so many of the conditions that we have in our lives as women, as human beings. And I think that certainly there is a lot to learn from each other, but I think as women, no matter what race we are, I think that we understand, the issues of what it is to be in this time, to live the lives that we do in this modern world that requires so much, and knowing that violence, still exists, and the issues that you've just outlined in terms of when someone becomes a mother and when someone chooses, like yourself, it's not the time. And for us, no one ever had the right to tell us what to do with our bodies, our minds, our children. That's always been our choice, and it still is to this day. And with that, I mean, there is a lot with it. I mean, when we sort of really push forward, well, what is that, right? And I talked about the inherent seat of authority in government. What does that look like, right? So having a judge with us, I think that's really wonderful. That would be something along the lines of our clan mothers, right? To really be able to have those choices and decisions. And so I do hope to see within the American system through the courts that there will be many decisions that are in favor and protection of young women. And ultimately, this leads to bigger issues. It's not just about abortion, but it's about the roles that women play and serve. And so within our governments, it's the women who even make the choice whether to go to war or not. The women decide that. Why? Because everything that we work to protect, our children, the land, our homes, right, as being those caretakers, that's what's at risk. And so just the quick impulse decision to act upon anger, to go to war, right, we recognize that ability, that power that women have to be able to see through issues in the long term and affecting the children and the future generations of our children, right? It's within the realm of women to generally think in that way. And so I just encourage women of today to begin to look at really what is the inherent power that you have. Because what I've seen is a system that really doesn't care too much about motherhood in the way as a mom would, right? But it's easy to just say, okay, well, you can only take so much for your leave when you have a baby, and then you have to go back to work. I mean, there's just so many decisions that are being made for women and their lives that it doesn't just come down to the issue of abortion. And as women who are coming into this place of leadership to recognize, to transcend and go beyond those issues and really place the role of motherhood central into the lives of the American culture and society and law within the government to protect that, because I find that it tends to be minimized. And that's why we have women in such vulnerable positions, that they tend to be the first ones to be victims of violence, sexual assault, because they're not valued in that society, right? And so that's what I'd like to just leave today. Yeah.
I'm glad that you bring up the broader context, and of course, even health issues for women and families go far beyond abortion. So can anyone speak a little bit to the issues that Indigenous women have been so outspoken on, like diet and access to clean water and healthy food and those other vital issues that are often kind of shunted to the side in favor of these crises moments?
Well, I know when I talk about the litigants that come before me, especially in the family court arena, they're already at so many steps behind. So if you have a vulnerable mother, child that comes before the court, they're already physically in a state of trauma, not only emotionally and physically. And I think that looking holistic, and I'm talking from the legal lens, because I look at what happened to Roe, domestic violence. It's not about the act, it's about the control. And so I think it's important that we begin to look, because all of these things we're talking ultimately end up in the court system. They ultimately end up before a judge, beginning to take, should we take in trauma into play? So I think it's important, and it's a kind of a roundabout answer, because that's what we're faced with, that we know that the persons that will be affected about our environmental justice are for women and women of color. And how do we educate? How do we do that? Is our system sophisticated enough to do it? I think that's the other major question.
And is our healthcare listening to women are our health professionals listening to women of color? I think
No.
Right, they're not.
No.
Right? And that plays out out in maternal mortality rates in this country and in this state. It's back to valuing people and listening to people and their voices. And we know that healthcare systems need to change. We know the court systems have to change to really take into account people's lived experiences and the historical trauma that we've put onto people.
And the economy needs to change and put stores that sell healthy food in neighborhoods of color. Changing subjects a bit, New York has this long, rich tradition of protest, and in particular related to gender-based issues. Tamar, what stand out in your mind as the greatest acts of political protest in New York's history?
This is a great question and a hard one to narrow down my answers to, but I will try to just pick a few highlights. So I think the Stonewall Riots of June 1969, which sparked the gay liberation movement, not only in the US, but also in Europe and across the world. The anti-nuclear weapons march in Central Park, also in June 1982, 750,000 people attended that rally and march for peace. And it actually influenced President Reagan to go back to the negotiation table with Gorbachev and to try to end the nuclear arms race. The AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP New York, disrupting trading on the Wall Street Exchange in 1989 to protest price gouging by pharmaceutical companies who were selling AZT, the first pharmaceutical treatment for AIDS, at really high prices. And that resulted in the company being called out and having to lower the prices, in fact. WHAM, Women's Health Action Mobilization, and the Statue of Liberty in July 1991. They hung a banner from the pedestal that read, "Abortion is healthcare, healthcare is a right." And this was recently done again in response to the Dobbs decision. So I think that one thing that's special about New York State is, because of our rich history here, we have symbols that are meaningful across the United States and indeed across the world, right? Wall Street means something to people across the world. Seneca Falls means something. And indeed, people come here. I have come here to the women's marches. Many women gathered here to protest Donald Trump's election. The Women's Strike for Equality had a large march here in 1978. So these symbols in our state, people recognize the power of them, and they are still potent places to get messages out and to create new movements for social change.
Wow, ask a historian of protest for their favorite protest moments and you'll be inspired. Do others have moments that stand out of activism or protest in New York history?
So I'm gonna make it more personal. So as Lucy said, I was Planned Parenthood's lobbyist in New York, and for years we were trying to get the Reproductive Health Act passed in New York, which codified Roe into New York state law. So, and I think it goes to personal commitment. So it was my job to make sure that got passed. And for 2 years, I quietly stood near the men's room in the Senate, on the Senate side of the legislative chamber, waiting for one man to come out and go to the men's room. Every time he had to see me, and I had to say, "How you feeling today, Senator? How are we doing? Am I going to get your vote?" And so for me, that was my personal protest that I'm very, very proud of. We got his vote, and then afterwards he said, "Now can I please go to the bathroom by myself?" I said, "Absolutely, absolutely you can." So that's, and I think that, we talk about those big things, but it's those little individual things that each one of us can do every day as a matter of protest.
I think that's so true. I have to just talk about something that happened last week. A gentleman was walking with the big signs acknowledging Harriet Tubman's birthday, 200 years. And it was so interesting. I stopped him, and he has a big sign on the back, and he said, "I'm walking in her shoes." He started, I think, in Philadelphia. He's coming through New York. He was in Harlem and walking through New Rochelle, where I saw him on my walk, and was going all the way up to to Canada. And he said, "I needed to feel what she felt." And I thought that was really powerful at this moment that we are in, at this very moment, that we can build on these movements, and we must build on these movements, because we have to understand that if we don't build on Harriet Tubman and everybody that you said, that we're going to lose it quickly.
Yeah. Well, for folks who are visiting or in the area, we'll let you know if you don't. I had the honor of going to visit Harriet Tubman's gravesite, which is just 10 minutes down the road in Auburn just yesterday. And so as you are making the pilgrimage to Seneca Falls, I certainly invite everyone to go there and spend a minute with that great American hero. Michelle?
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that from a very different perspective as the Haudenosaunee people who are here in these territories. And for us, really, it's about the recognition of our lands and not to take one more inch or to, ensure that our treaties are upheld. So there have been many occasions where our people have just literally stopped the traffic on the major highways because they run right through our territories. And there's been instances where Department of Transportation wanted to extend a lane into our people's lands. And we said, no, this is not happening. You don't have approval for this. We didn't, we didn't have any type of negotiations about this. And so no, it's not happening. In addition to that, our ability to pass between the borders of US and Canada. So every year our people will show up at the bridges, at the crossing between the two to honor the Jay Treaty, which allows us free passage in between the two, between the US and Canada, because these borders ran right through our territories and between our people. Yeah.
I'm just going to put a final question to each of these remarkable women. Tamar, what do you tell your students about keeping hope in these difficult times? What's one concrete thing that they or listeners can do to make things better for women of the future?
Well, I think each one of us can become an agent for change in our communities, and I tell them to stay informed, to follow the news, and to vote. I think that's the first step for everyone.
Judge, what's your biggest hope for the state's legal system, and what's a concrete thing that New Yorkers can do for women of the future?
On the first question, my hope is through the education, specifically through the Institute, that we begin to educate judges as to who is that person before them. So to know that even with Indigenous people, that if the child comes before the court, there's specific petitions that we have with specific questions, because if there's an issue of removing that child, that they should know that you just can't put a child, as you say, with a rich history to someone else. So that's the first thing, to educate the judges, to begin to know what questions to ask. As you said, I've had domestic violence survivors say to me, no, Judge, don't put that in the order. I know when to leave, make that time. The second thing, and as I say, I'm speaking from the world I come from, now you see how important it is for you to know who are these judges either running for office or being appointed. Go when they're campaigning or being appointed, consider it, and ask them, well, what have you done lately for people of color? Don't just show up and the campaign world. We have to become invested, because all of them start someplace and build. So that would be become involved and get to know who is this person running, and ask them these questions.
Kelly, you've made your career in public service. How do you stay inspired in dark days to stay in service? And what's something concrete that New Yorkers can do?
Yeah, so it's the dark days that keep me in service and keep me motivated. It's those, it's we can't ever forget, right? We can't ever forget what we're here to do. Some days are rough, and it's not a quick fix. And I guess what I would say to New Yorkers is be proud of our history. Be proud, but own our history as well, and look for a better future. And to the judge's point, I can't think there's anything better than we should be thinking about right now is who we put in judgeships, who we put in district attorneys' positions, who we put in those positions that ultimately look like they're making the decisions for women. So it's not always about the president. It's sometimes about those people on your school board that you ought to be thinking about.
Michelle, what is your wish for women and girls right now, and what's a concrete thing that people can do to make things better?
I think what's really important is to bring Indigenous voice to the table as much as everyone can within your workspace, and to think about, what is the voice and perspective that is missing, right? And it tends to be ours, and I'm not speaking for all peoples, obviously, but ours has been missing for a long time. And so how do you begin to build relationship with Indigenous peoples and to bring that perspective to the table? And so I see a lot of organizations starting to build land acknowledgements, and really it's the recognition of that history and collective history, and to start to bring that into the present and into workspaces, and bringing Indigenous peoples to the table to become decision makers, to have input in all of the spaces that we're talking about today. Because ultimately that perspective perspective will then, be brought into those organizations and workspaces and really does look out for women and girls. And to think about, well, what are the treaty obligations that we have to be here? Because for us, we like to remind people that either you're here by treaty or because it was stolen land. And so if we can begin to honor that and look at our collective history, we can begin to see each other as a people and what can we learn from each other. So I'd like to just leave this, is that our former Taradaho chief Lee in Shenandoah, Gahak, he's in the sky world now, he was asked once, if you could wish away all non-native people and make this native land once again, would you do it? And he said no. He said, because Creator brought everybody here for a reason. And I don't know what that reason is, but it's up to all of us to figure that out. And I think that we're really at that time. And so I'd like to just leave you with that.
Thank you for that. So many thanks to these speakers. Thank you to everyone who tuned in for caring about these issues of national import. Many thanks to Jennifer Gabriel, the staff, and the board of the National Women's Hall of Fame, and to my incredible team at the offices of the New York State Inspector General for their work planning today's gathering, including Aries de la Cruz, Pauline Ross, Peter Amoroso, Carly Sigelski, Jack Wild, Amanda Brennan, and Jeff Haber. Please follow our work at New York State IG, on all social media platforms. Stay safe and healthy, and in the spirit of Seneca Falls and the suffragists, don't forget to vote. Thank you for being here today.